Hi, this is Brian Adnoff. Welcome to our webinar on the Farm Bill, hemp-derived minor cannabinoids and regulatory mayhem. Our first speaker is Dr. Adie Rae. She's a PhD and neuroscientist with expertise in translational and clinical research of cannabis. She is a research scientist at the Legacy Research Institute and was vice chair of the Oregon Cannabis Commission from 2019 to 2024. Adie's multifaceted research ranges from synaptic physiology to clinical pharmacology, focusing on pain management, misuse liability, cannabis opioid interactions, and harm reduction. And I got to know Adie. I saw her in a webinar, and I was truly impressed with her work. And I contacted her and asked her if she would join us and help us out as a D4DPR expert. And she's been serving in that capacity for a couple of years now. So very, very excited to have her start our webinar. Adie?
Yeah, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here and to talk about this topic, which is one of my favorites, favorite slash least favorite, I guess. Um, I think a natural place to start is with the cannabis-derived cannabinoids, the plant-derived cannabinoids. What I'm showing here is sort of the biosynthetic pathway by which all cannabis plants make cannabinoids, starting with the precursor CBGA. And when you see the word hemp here, that's because from the plant's perspective, there is no difference between cannabis and hemp. All of these plants can be hybridized to produce fertile offspring. So this is the same pathway in all varieties of cannabis, including the ones that we legally label as hemp. Importantly, the main plant-derived cannabinoids that we'll use sort of as our examples today are CBG, delta-9 THC, and CBD or cannabidiol. And that one in particular will be really important for all of the semi-synthetics that we'll talk about later. When I say synthesis, what we're talking about is how manufacturers and laboratories are synthesizing these cannabinoids, these novel cannabinoids like HHC, using CBD or cannabidiol as a precursor. And so the way that this is done is by using acids and solvents through a series of chemical reactions to arrive at these major products like HHC and other impairing cannabinoids. Um, so, depending on which endpoint folks are trying to get to, they'll use different solvents and different acids, but to some degree, the process is the same. No matter what products you're ending up with, the process is relatively the same. Start with CBD, use some acids and solvents, and get your products. What's important here is you can see that there are multiple products that end up in the final solution or the final oil. And so that'll be really important to keep in mind later because although folks think they might be buying an HHC product, for example, they're actually buying a product that contains HHC along with all the other things. I want to highlight these acids and solvents because due to a lack of regulation, it's not always clear whether or not there are any of these acids and solvents remaining or residual in the final product. So that's a major thing of concern. It's one of the reasons, one of the benefits we have of the regulated cannabis industry is making sure that we don't have any of these residual toxins or solvents. No matter what molecules we're working with, they work relatively similarly in that there is a target for all these molecules inside the brain. And that target, that receptor that has a relationship with these molecules in several different ways. The primary way is that something like delta 9 THC will act as an agonist or an activator of the receptor in the same way that our own natural neurotransmitters act. Then there are other categories of molecules that act as antagonists, which essentially turn off that or turn off the receptor or do the opposite of what our natural neurotransmitters do. Of course, this is super simplified because there are lots of other ways that these receptors can be activated. There are inverse agonists, indirect agonists, allosteric modulators, positive and negative. So I want to just give you a really simplified version that whatever we're talking about in terms of pharmacology, these different molecules are going to fall into these different categories of receptor binding agents. And so if we look at CBG, for example, we know that some of the targets that CBG acts at are, the CB1 receptor, of course, which is primarily located in the brain, where it's a weak agonist. The CB2 receptor, it's a partial agonist. But then at other receptors like PPAR gamma, it's actually a full agonist. And this is true, this is a pattern that we can see with CBD as well. It does different things at different receptors. Same thing for delta 9, although delta 9 is more reliably an agonist or partial agonist at most of these targets. And these four are just, the top four that are the most well understood, but there are tons of other places where all of these chemicals bind to create their effects. And it really does matter what the concentration is of these molecules because they will do different things at different concentrations. Now, if you look at the bottom of this pyramid here, that's what we're talking about, that we've got these, chemicals that are binding at receptors to, and have some kind of a change in the cellular function that's actually happening inside the cells. But it's the sum total of all of those chemicals acting at all of their targets that starts to lead to these more clinical effects like pain relief, mood regulation, sleep regulation, and then the subjective effects such as euphoria, anti-anxiety. And the two subjective effects that I'll spend the remainder of the time thinking about are impairment and those adverse effects like psychotic-like symptoms, paranoia, racing heart, all of the classic sort of THC overdose kind of symptoms. So when discussing these particular symptoms, there's a big component or a big example that we can draw on with delta 9 THC. So we know that delta 9 THC is a partial agonist at the CB1 receptor, and it is this relationship between the structure of delta 9 and how it fits into that CB1 receptor that leads to euphoria, impairment, and all of the other, adverse effects. What's really important is if you look at the structure of delta 9 THC, it's very similar to all of these other cannabinoids, and that is, we propose that's probably why it is acting. It has so many similar subjective effects, including those adverse effects. So the structure function relationship is really important. The CB1 receptor is primarily what's underlying these impairing effects, psychomotor impairment, and even poisonings in pediatric patients, especially. So when it comes to naturally derived delta 9 THC versus synthetically or semi-synthetically produced delta 9 THC or semi-synthetically produced analogs or molecular cousins of delta 9 THC, the brain doesn't care. The brain has no preference. It does not distinguish between fully synthetic delta 9 THC, in other words, Marinol, the FDA approved medication, versus hemp-derived delta 9 versus cannabis-derived delta 9. It's all the same to the brain. Now, for some of these molecules, we do know that they are analogs of delta 9 because they induce cannabimimetic effects. They act like a cannabinoid. And in rodents, we can see that they have this sort of pattern of behavior called the tetrad. So we know that they act like delta 9 because they produce all of these cannabis-like effects or the tetrad effects in rodents. So these are essentially all of the hemp-derived cannabinoids that I could find pharmacology on in the peer-reviewed literature. This is it. It's not a very exhaustive list compared to the huge lists that we can see that's available on the market. I have all these guys over in the non-impairing category, but with a big caveat that they're only non-impairing when they are in isolation. So a lot of times these hemp-derived products are contaminated with some of the other molecules that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, which we presume to be CB1 agonists. However, there are tons of other cannabinoids out there, including a bunch more that aren't even, I didn't have room to fit on this slide, and they have never been studied in terms of which receptors they're binding at. We can only assume that they're acting as an agonist at CB1 because they produce impairment. But we don't know anything else about which receptors they're binding to, what is the receptor affinity, what is their potency, right? So how much or how much less potent are they compared to delta 9, which is sort of our baseline of understanding for CB1 agonism. They've never been studied in rodents. They've never been studied for safety. We just have absolutely no data about these compounds at all. So when we're thinking about the unknowns of all of those compounds, we have to consider that unknowns are risks. So, we have no information whatsoever about what they would do in rodents, much less humans, what the side effect profile of all of these, novel cannabinoids are. Then there's this other layer of risk, which is, well, what happens when you spray them on the inside of your lungs? Some of these chemicals, particularly the acetates, when they're heated, they actually form ketene gas, which is a toxic gas, which definitely should not be breathed. So what we also don't know is, how much exposure to a ketene gas can a person tolerate before they experience toxicity. So it's probably very likely that, like other things, the dose really matters, and a low level of exposure where someone inhales, this ketene gas once, maybe nothing deleterious would happen. But like the EVALI outbreak that we saw in 2019, if people are consuming, a vaporizer cartridge and heating these cannabinoids and inhaling them 5 or more times per day, that's when we're probably going to start to see things like lipoid pneumonia.
Should listen to this. And again,
Another thing to consider is that, I sort of teased at this before in that, when these products are being converted from cannabidiol, that it's not a very clean conversion. You get multiple products. And so this is just one example from the UNC Street Drug Analysis Lab. Someone thought they were buying a Delta 9 THC edible, and in fact, it included all of these other cannabinoids as well. This is an exceptional specimen because we do have a laboratory test for it. But a lot of these products, we have absolutely no idea what is actually in the product versus what the label says is in the product. So this is what we would consider contamination with other cannabinoids. And that contamination is not reflected on the label, nor is the potency always accurate. And of course, we talked before about the possibility that when these products are created, there could be residual solvents and other toxins like pesticides that appear in the products. All of these risks are especially concerning for children. Where we don't have childproof packaging, we don't have accurate labels, where the parents aren't even aware that this product might be impairing, and they're not stored properly. There's no communication about, what this product is. That's where we see, kids and toddlers end up in the emergency department because no one even really knew what was in this product. So with that, I'll turn it over to our next speakers. The one thing that I did want to mention, we talked about naturally derived Delta 9 THC, and I'm thinking about the recent hemp cannabinoid ban in California, and how, there's not really a very clear path for what to do here because, some of those hemp derived products help Hemp-derived delta-9 THC products are some of the lowest THC products that exist on the market, 1 and 2 milligrams of THC, whereas in licensed dispensaries, a more common dose is 5 to 10 milligrams of THC. So it's not a really straightforward calculus in terms of what to do with hemp-derived delta-9 in particularly, because there's a risk of doing more harm by attempting to perform harm reduction. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much, Adie. That's pretty scary stuff. Our next speaker is Matt Zorn. Matt is a lawyer, is recognized as one of the leading authorities in the U.S. on issues related to the federal CSA, or Controlled Substance Act. Matt earned his JD from Columbia University and practices with Yetter Coleman, LLP, in Texas. Matt, along with his colleague Shane Pennington, has successfully challenged the DEA on seminal cases involving both cannabis and psychedelics, pushing the DEA towards greater transparency and accountability. He's the guy when discussing the law and cannabis as well as psychedelics. We are thrilled to have him on the board of D4DPR. And just a side note in terms of one of the really key things he did was to get the DEA to, after many years, accept other licensees for production of cannabis for research other than the University of Mississippi. So, Matt, go for it.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Brian, for the introduction. And Matt Zorn, practice at Yetter Coleman. I think I would start off by noting, so I've sued the DEA a bunch, and one of those cases was probably the least known of a lot of the cases I've done, because it was the one that we lost. It was on behalf of Hemp Industries Association, challenging a particular rule that interim final rule that DEA put out involving hemp products. I also was counsel on a case involving smokable hemp ban. So I've done a lot with marijuana, psychedelics, or whatnot, but I've done a little bit of hemp. And I think the first place I kind of want to talk about the law, kind of why do we have these substances sold at gas stations, among other places? And to answer that question, the answer is the 2014 and 2018 farm bills. But to answer that question, I think we need to first talk about what it is that the federal 2014 and 2018 farm bills replaced. And with a caveat of, I'm going to focus on federal law because that's kind of where the game was played for at least, the past 7 decades or so, maybe even 8 decades. But to be clear, and I'll conclude on this note, the state laws vary. Some states do prohibit intoxicating cannabinoids, among other things. So just keep that in mind. So again, what did the 2014 and 2018 farm bills replace? They replaced a regime under the Controlled Substances Act where whether marijuana was contraband was defined by what part of the plant you were looking at. And the reason that this is important is, well, going back to 1937 and the Marijuana Tax Act, the intent was never to prohibit hemp, which has a long storied history in our country. Hemp is useful for all sorts of things. But the plan was to try to at first tax and then prohibit marijuana. Again, marijuana and hemp are the same plant, so we're not really talking about something different. What we're really talking about is whether the plant can get you high or not. So the system, the statute, the legislation that was put forward in the Tax Act and later carried forward in the Controlled Substances Act was a system where what the law prohibited was defined by what part of the plant you were looking at. This created a lot of problems because, as a practical matter, the law excluded things like sterilized seeds and the stalks of the plants and whatnot of cannabis plants, but you couldn't actually ever obtain the excluded part of a plant without growing the whole plant and creating the contraband, which would be like the bud of the plant that had the THC in it. So again, the legislation tried to exclude the non-psychoactive parts of the plant to allow hemp products, but you couldn't actually grow the excluded parts without getting the non-excluded parts. So the hemp industry, for all intents and purposes, did not really exist in the US, except for imported products. That was kind of the way around this. You could import hemp seeds into the US. But still, there was this definitional problem of any cannabis, like you couldn't have cannabinoids because cannabinoids would be derived from the parts of the plant that the law prohibited, and the way the law was defined, derivatives of contraband parts of the plant would also be illegal. So that's where we are up to 2014. And what the 2014 Farm Bill did, and it was built on by the 14, then the 18 Farm Bill, it revolutionized how we defined what was legal and what wasn't legal in the plant. And specifically, the law now measures whether something is quote unquote hemp based on whether or not it has 0.3% delta 9 THC by dry weight. It's a really simple test. There's no complication to it. If what you're looking at has more than 0.3% THC dry weight and comes from a cannabis plant, it's still marijuana. If it's got less than that, it's hemp. The excluded parts of the plant definition actually still exist in the Controlled Substances Act, but the way the law defines hemp, it carves hemp out of marijuana. So if it falls in hemp, it's carved out of marijuana and it's illegal. There's still a definition of THC in the Controlled Substances Act, and courts in the 2000s, there are some lawsuits where the Ninth Circuit interpreted that to only apply to synthetic tetrahydrocannabinols, so not tetrahydrocannabinols that naturally occur in the plant. So that, in a nutshell, explains the cannabinoid industry, if you think about it, which is the Farm Bill basically created this 0.3% test. And then in the 18 Farm Bill, it made an aspect of the definition a little bit more explicit to include derivatives, extracts, and so forth of hemp. And so the cannabinoids we have on the market are just hemp derivatives, or hemp extracts. And I'll talk briefly about Delta 8. Delta 8 is a good example of Delta 8 naturally occurs in hemp. And insofar as it is extracted from hemp, it's quite clearly legal under the statute because Delta 8 doesn't have a Delta 9 level of greater than 0.3% Delta 9 dry weight. But most Delta 8 on the market is not extracted from a plant. It's commercially infeasible to simply extract Delta 8 and so forth. And so it's converted from CBD. That's legal too when you read the definition, because you start with hemp, and then if you get CBD from hemp, the CBD is a hemp derivative. And again, the law says derivatives of hemp are hemp. And then you derive Delta 8 from the CBD, and the Delta 8 becomes hemp because the CBD was hemp, and therefore the Delta. So that's how you can get all these cannabinoids, even if they are made by chemical reactions, so long as it is a derivative of hemp. It's just whether it's derived from hemp, and it doesn't have a and the final product doesn't have a 0.3% 9 delta, 0.3% delta 9 THC weight. And the reason this is proliferated is not just because this stuff is not a controlled substance. I want to talk about the legality. I'll return there in just a moment. But when we think about the major impediment to the marijuana industry, and again, I use the term marijuana only to differentiate it from hemp and as a legal matter. Cannabis is cannabis. But when we think about the regulated marijuana industry, I just want to be clear that the main impediment to that is 280E, and the cannabinoid industry is not under the 280E because it's not a controlled substance. That again, it's not a controlled substance. So This has been tested in the courts only kind of tangentially. It hasn't been kind of squarely tested in any case. There is the case that Shane and I litigated where the court never reached the merits of the case, so it was dismissed on standing. That case kind of did attempt to directly take on one aspect of the problem. And then there are two cases that I'll talk about. One very recent case called Diamondback. It's an Americans for Disabilities Act case. And then there was 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, maybe, a couple recently, but a little bit ago, in the Ninth Circuit, there was a case called the AK Futures case, which was a trademark case. And succinctly stated, the AK Futures case was a case where the trademark was challenged on grounds of legality, and the grounds were sort of that Delta 8 wasn't legal. The Ninth Circuit read the statute and said, you know what, Delta 8 basically says exactly what I just said. Delta 8 derived from hemp and therefore legal, no legality problem. The recent Diamondback case says effectively the same thing. I believe there was THCO was at issue. The court kind of agreed with the AK Futures case. And the issue, again, came up in the context of the Americans Disability Act and was whether lawful or not. In neither case was the DEA or the U.S. government. Neither case did they really show up. So I take it with a little bit of salt, but in both of those cases have pretty strong wordings. So my final notes on the matter. The first is I kind of carelessly was using legal, not legal, or whatnot. I want to be clear. It's not controlled. We still have the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, certain acts of misbranding or introducing drugs into commerce. And to the extent a cannabinoid product is considered to be a drug, an intoxicating cannabinoid, it could violate, it depends on the circumstances, but it could violate the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. I didn't really discuss that, but to be clear, controlled and legal aren't always the same thing. The other thing is there's a lot, there's kind of some deeper ideas here. There's THCA, which, if you combust THCA, it becomes THC. In Texas, people call it the Texas two-step, where, you sell the THCA, you light it up, and that's THC. I'm not convinced this is legal at all. For one reason, it seems to very clearly be like kind of like a how do I put it, like an attempt, sorry, not an attempt. It's an in-code offense where you basically give someone the tools to commit the offense. So it's like if you're selling a product whose only useful way to use it is to light it up, then you are aiding and abetting. It escaped me. You're aiding and abetting someone else's creation of THC. So I'm not convinced any of that's legal, but that hasn't been tested by the courts, and it seems to be everywhere in states where you can't buy actual THC. And then again, and I could say the same thing about Delta 9 gummies. I have, but generally speaking, the other cannabinoids writ large, I think, are legal subject to the FDCA. And then, of course, the final point here, again, I'll end where I started, which is I'm talking about federal law here. States have traditionally regulated controlled substances in parallel. The 2014 and 2018 Farm Bills allow states to have their own regimes for hemp production, and so on and so forth. And so some states have banned cannabinoids. And simply put, the federal legality doesn't really help you there. So you kind of have to go state by state. I don't have enough time to pull out a map and kind of point you to all the different states and all the different nuances, but hire an attorney maybe if you're concerned about the question. But that's the basic landscape, and I think that kind of tells you from a legal perspective how it is that we got here. So I think my time is up. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Fascinating history. Okay, our next speaker is Chris Lindsay. Chris is also a lawyer, and he served as a cannabis attorney and lobbyist at both the state and federal levels seeking cannabis policy reform, as well as medical cannabis, as well as being a former medical cannabis business owner. He's helped draft and pass both medical cannabis and adult use laws for the Marijuana Policy Project, which I think is where I first interacted with Chris. And he currently serves as Director of State Advocacy and Public Policy at the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, or attached. And my bad for not mentioning when I first opened things up that Attach is co-sponsoring this webinar with us. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Starting my timer. So thank you for having me here. Just to kind of explain a little bit of where my organization, our frame of reference on this. So Attach is a 501c6. So we're a entity that represents the licensed cannabis businesses that have sort of emerged in the wake of state legalization. So if you're aiming to open up an adult use legalization store in Florida sometime next year following a successful voter initiative, we would love for you to consider joining. So that's kind of who we represent. We started to get into this issue around hemp intoxicants a couple of years ago. It wasn't very long after products hit the market, and it was really just out of concern that, here are these products, we don't actually know anything about them, where they came from, but consumers are definitely confused. We were seeing people thinking they were, coming from licensed dispensaries, even in ERs and poison control centers. They were seeing spikes and attributing it to legalization. So there was this kind of early concern of conflating these products. And of course, being worried that people are getting sick on this. This isn't what any of us want to see associated with the work that we're doing. So it became an increasing sort of curiosity along those lines for a while. But things really took a turn when we started to see hemp interests going into federal court and trying to make the claim that they've been legalized by the federal government. This is now preempted. States can't touch us. If we want to mail this directly to your son, that's something we can do, because legalization, that kind of just bold argument and pushing back. And that's where we got some of the current cases that Matt mentioned. Those cases, by the way, weren't really directly about this, but sort of got there indirectly. Now, I would just say, by the way, that Matt and I are both lawyers. We're not courts of law. We're not lawmakers. So we definitely have opinions about how all this stuff works. But to his point, we haven't seen it tested. Matt makes a great case that this stuff's decontrolled. I could make a case that they're not. We don't know. DEA is actually starting to do enforcement in Texas on this, and they're being challenged just along the lines that Matt laid out. So the jury's out, pun intended. But in terms of how this stuff falls, I think there are a lot of questions. And that's part of the problem, is this stuff gets kicked up. It's very confusing. It's hard to know, well, what can states do? I mean, literally, I've talked to lawmakers saying, I want to put limitations on these products, but I don't want to set us up for a lawsuit. That's not helping. And so, it's this sort of murky situation in which everybody's trying to kind of understand where the chips have fallen, where that leaves regulators, where that leaves businesses. All this stuff's up in the air. So it was that point when we entered in. So we've been doing several things on this issue. One is lobbying members of Congress directly, primarily through the Farm Bill, with the idea that, look, this loophole that is sort of allowed in all these intoxicants, when clearly that was not what Congress ever intended, that needs to be addressed. Second would be the states, where, to Matt's point, federal government can almost make any call at once. States are still where all the chips are going to fall, and they're the ones that are going to have to end up with workable regulatory systems. So that's part of it, is working with states to try to figure out the best solutions. And then we're also participating as friends of the court, and part of that is in response to AK Futures and even Diamondback, where we think the courts got it wrong. They there's a lot behind this. I could argue it, and I'm not here to do that. But I would just say that not all courts are lining up on this issue. We're seeing actually split district, what appears to be two different kind of takes on this issue. So, but I appreciate the fact that Matt made one thing very clear, and that is the fact that we can talk all day long about Controlled Substances Act, yes or no. But it's certainly a misnomer to then leap to the conclusion that if you're no longer controlled, that means you're federally legal. And it's that aspect of it that I think has been the most harmful, because it sort of bestows a hemp halo over certain types of products to sort of suggest that they live in a rarefied space that doesn't really need to be treated the same as marijuana. And that's where we see a lot of the harms in terms of stuff just rocketing right into the marketplace. It's there, Delta 8, generally speaking, isn't coming through regulated systems. It's showing up in gas stations and it's getting sent there directly. And so, we think that creates all kinds of problems. And, for all of the reasons that Dr. Rae has outlined, this stuff is pretty scary. And it's because of this combination of dependence on a synthetic conversion process and then a zero oversight, like zero. It's shocking. There's no products in America that you can purchase that haven't gone through some kind of regulatory system. Much less the intoxicants. And yet here we are really just totally experimenting on consumers, one cannabinoid at a time. So anyway, I can riff on that for a long time. So what's actually happening? So at the federal level, so our organization's lobbying, and we've been talking with the committees of jurisdiction over the Farm Bill. I can tell you that Congress very much wants to close the loophole. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of which vehicle are they going to do it in. There is zero appetite, other than one member of Congress that I can think of, and that's probably Nancy Mace, that would suggest that we should legalize synthetic THC, much less that we should do it in a farm bill, which has to be reauthorized every 5 years. And so sort of anchoring your hopes that that's going to be the place that we're going to open up the floodgates and legalize this plant, Congress is not interested in that. And frankly, they're not super happy with the hemp lobby, who told them this was definitely about rope and definitely not about dope, 5 years ago. And nobody's talking about rope today. And members of Congress that care about farming do not appreciate that part of the conversation. And so there's really no appetite for there to be this kind of moment where they're like, you know what, gosh, maybe we should just let these businesses continue to operate, because that's just not the way they're thinking about it. There are, the only real issue that we face at this point is the dysfunction of Congress, which is significant. And so there's a lot of interest across the both sides of the aisle. You've got prohibitionists alongside members of Congress who are from legalization states that say, the prohibitionists, that's easy. They don't support any of this stuff, whether it's natural or not. The folks from legalization states say, wait a minute, we worked hard. This is Gavin Newsom. I worked hard to put together a regulatory system for all this stuff. We get revenue, we test it, we make sure the labels are right, and here comes these other products. This would be like shortly after the end of alcohol prohibition, the bathtub gin guys say, you know what? We ended prohibition. Why don't we get in this? Wheat's legal. I should be able to sell my product. It's made from wheat. I mean, that's kind of where we're at right now. And we're having this kind of weird policy discussion, I think largely because the conversation is so complicated that it sort of lets in a lot of gray that maybe wouldn't apply if we were talking about other kinds of products. All right. So I guess that's sort of the federal scene where I think it's just a matter of time before Congress comes in and says, if it's got THC in it, you cannot avail yourself of the name hemp. That's no longer a thing. What effect will that have? I think the industry is well situated right now to continue to operate. And I think that what'll happen is it'll just more clearly have to operate within state regulatory frameworks. And so I think the future of all of this is going to be driving towards regulatory parity. And so that means that once states clearly have the ball, the question is going to be, what's the best way to do this? We already have regulatory systems for THC derived from this plant. That's our starting point. It's very much the case that some of them are over-regulated and they probably need to dial back. But hopefully we're going to end up with somewhere in the middle where we treat it as a reasonable product, and everybody's, some states are going to be like Minnesota, or even, well, Minnesota is a good middle ground where they have both hemp-based products and marijuana, and they're both in the same regulatory system. They have different lanes. We have some states. We've got Wyoming, no to all of it. We've got Kentucky, no to marijuana. We're in on hemp intoxicants, including of synthetic. And so in terms of our approach as a trade association, the important thing is that there is a regulatory framework that these businesses have to operate within at the state level. It's not a hemp business in Kentucky that we're worried about. It's a business in another state that thinks that it can mail directly to teenagers in a neighboring state because they can, right? That's the one that we actually don't want to see continue, because we think that's a loaded gun ready to go off. It's just a matter of time. And it is, and these problems are already happening. And so that's the main piece. We also are, as an organization, very uncomfortable with synthetic products. For all the reasons that have been outlined, we think that it's important that we regulate them on their own terms and not conflate them with natural THC, which has a much better safety profile because it doesn't have all these other contaminants. We've been, frankly, using and abusing Delta-9 grown out of the ground for millennia. We know how far you can go with that. No idea what happens when we start consuming massive amounts of these other minor cannabinoids. Maybe it'll be a good time for everybody, maybe not. We just don't know. So that's really where we're at, and I appreciate the discussion. Handing the mic back to you, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Interesting discussion. Well, now we'll hear from a doctor that's fitting for our group. And this will be Tanya Adams, who is not only a doctor, but she's on the board of D4DPR. She's board certified in family medicine and lifestyle medicine. In her solo practice, Tanya incorporates lifestyle changes and cannabis to prevent, treat, and reverse chronic illnesses. She's an advocate of proper labeling, third-party testing, and dosing, very relevant to this conversation, and advocates for regulation to standardize these practices at the state and local levels. She was a founding member of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and as I mentioned, she's been a superb board member of our group. Yeah, so go ahead, Tanya.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Brian. And to that, I just want to add that I'm also a family member of an owner of a CBD brand, and we follow our recommendations that I'm going to lay out here. And so I have some firsthand knowledge of how some of these CBD brands can potentially benefit financially, but also the risks that are involved. So we're careful with our products as well. With that, I wanted to outline, I'm going to be representing Doctors for Drug Policy Reform with regard to this talk, and then I'll add a little bit about how it affects our products personally as well. So right now, the regulatory landscape is such that the cannabis plant is botanically identical to hemp plant, marijuana, all these terms. And as the other speakers have mentioned, we're basically just using these terms in a legal sense to separate hemp from marijuana. And it's based on the percent less than 0%, 0.3% of delta 9 THC by weight would classify that product as hemp. And we already talked about the Farm Bill and how that's affected some of the allowed the cultivation of hemp. And really it was intended to allow products to be made from hemp. And out of that, one of the products that has been produced is CBD. And CBD has been able to be used for fiber, seed oil, biocomposite plastics. It's being used to produce some of the BMWs in this country and in Germany, building materials, and it has a lot of potential actually. We also get CBD out of this process, and because it was federally regulated and allowed to be produced, the price of CBD came down significantly, and that allowed manufacturers to then take the CBD and make other semi-synthetic intoxicating cannabinoids, as Adie has so brilliantly outlined, and whether they come from hemp or marijuana, these products, we have not tested or used these in humans, whereas CBD and THC, there's a breadth of knowledge regarding the human and animal studies and the human reaction. So we know some of these things are safe and others we really don't know. And according to the Controlled Substance Act, as we said, the isomers of a THC substance is a Schedule I controlled substance, but there's some question as to what it hasn't been tested as to whether or not some of these hemp-derived cannabinoid intoxicants really are illegal, and it hasn't really been tested, as Matt has mentioned. And that wasn't really the intention of the Farm Bill. So it wasn't really outlined in the Farm Bill, which is why we're in this question and resulting in this mayhem, as we said. So several states have now banned or imposed regulations on the sale, as Chris just mentioned. And some of this we've already reviewed. So I'm just going to go a little quickly through the part of this part. One of the things that Doctors for Cannabis Regulation is very concerned about is obviously the safety and where these products are ending up. So one of the wonderful things about regulation is we can have safe food, we can have safe drink, and it can come from places like gas stations and outlets that you normally wouldn't be considered like a cannabis dispensary, for instance. But when you have no regulation over these products, we don't really know what's safe, and we may end up with residual metals, acids, salts that we know are actually harmful. So why would we think that these products should be safe? Matt kind of outlined some of these. Let's see, let me go back. Oh yeah, okay, so here we are. So some of the known risks of semi-synthetic cannabinoids would be that their drug testing may show that these minor cannabinoids might show up as delta 9 THC. And if somebody's going for a drug test for a job, for instance, or if they have a child custody case, it can affect those cases, and it can be very dangerous for the user, besides the inherent dangers of the cannabinoids themselves. And we know that there's been a lot of reports of adverse events, including dyspnea, which is shortness of breath, seizures, and there's been a lot of calls to poison control. However, it should be noted that we don't really know what was consumed by these patients that had these adverse events, because sometimes the products could be labeled just like that label that Adie showed, showing that it was supposed to be a Delta 9 product, and it turned out that there was Delta 8 and other minor semi-synthetic intoxicating cannabinoids in those products. So again, we just really don't know. And a lot of these products have been skyrocketing in the industry, and this is where I can tell you that our own family business is providing CBD products and some of the known minor cannabinoids like CBG and CBN, which we know how those products react in the human body. We've had an opportunity to produce products with Delta 10, for instance, or some of the other minor semi-synthetic cannabinoids, and probably we would have been able to capitalize on that. But my husband and my daughter run this company, and they have me as their regulatory oversight. And knowing that we really just don't know how these cannabinoids work in the human body, we don't produce any of those types of cannabinoids. In fact, we don't even use some of the delivery devices that you might find, like pens. They can have batteries that can run too hot, and we don't really know how vaping can sometimes affect. We know that it sometimes can be detrimental to the lungs, for instance. So all of our products are safe, and we err on the side of caution until we know more. But I'm sure there are, and I know there are many companies that are producing these products and making a nice income, but it's at the consumer's peril. And one thing that we want to point out is that there are states that have no medical marijuana laws on the books, but they allow some of these products to be produced and sold, and the regulators look the other way because they have a conflict of interest with some of the industry who are making significant money on these products. So it's creating kind of a void for the consumer where they can't get safe products. They can only get products that are potentially or probably unsafe. And D4DPR, as always, recommends a framework where regulation is really the key to safety, and we want to see implement a regulatory framework for these intoxicating cannabinoids that we can keep consumers safe until we know more about them. So one of the ways of doing that is requiring licensing for selling intoxicating cannabinoids. And I just want to point out that we don't D4DPR doesn't necessarily advocate for differentiating between hemp, marijuana, CBD, hemp, marijuana, cannabis. We understand that's one plant, but the regulatory framework existed before 1937. They made a distinction, and now we have to deal with that distinction. So we're working within the framework that's already existing. We feel that using taxation would be a way to provide funding for health initiatives and have regulatory oversight to make products safer. We certainly want to regulate packaging and the sale to minors, so that intoxicating products and dangerous products are not appealing to children, such as having childproof containers and an appropriate symbol. The International Intoxicating Cannabinoid Product symbol was developed by our founder, and that is something that we want to make sure that we're trying to get adopted by multiple states, and it's something that is readily recognized so that parents and even children can recognize the label and know that is something that is potentially of danger. And we require mandatory, well, we would like to have mandatory certificates of analysis. I can tell you with my family's products, we have extra testing so that we have available certificates of analysis online that matches the QR code on our products. It's not something that's required. That's something that we do that's above and beyond. But I would advocate for seeing that for all companies being able to, so that the consumer can find out what exactly is in that product. But that costs extra money. So probably most manufacturers are not going to do that unless they're required to. And we would like to see regulations for minor cannabinoids in line with other cannabis products and adult use guidelines in the state. We don't necessarily see them as different. However, because the difference is not in the inherently in the cannabinoids or the synthetic cannabinoids, as Adie said, the brain doesn't know if it's synthetic or non-synthetic. But because we don't understand how some of these semi-synthetic products work at this point in time, we don't have enough information to say that it would be safe, but we would like the regulations to align with that. And in other words, not necessarily differentiating based on the type of cannabinoid, but based on its safety. And we would like to encourage the states without a regulatory framework to develop one. There's a lot of states out there that it's literally the Wild West and anything goes. There's really no recommendation. And as far as the scheduling of cannabis, we call for the descheduling of cannabis at the federal level, so that we can eliminate some of these confusions between hemp, cannabis, marijuana, and establish a regulatory framework that can apply and be adapted by individual states. And we recognize that an outright ban on minor cannabinoids would result in the continuation of making them just outright illegal, and that just really enables the drug war to continue, and that can really lead to negative public health effects. So the regulation can be a way of guidelines so that we can have safe products, but we're not banning products outright. So that really is one of the main reasons why D4DPR exists. Of course, we feel that we started historically really focusing on cannabis, but we feel that really applies to psychedelics and some of the other medicinal plant-based and even non-plant-based products that exist. And this policy, you can find basically everything that I have here in this presentation in our position statement online with and D4DPR. And I hope that helps summarize our stance, and we hope that regulators are listening. And I appreciate Matt and Chris's efforts in communicating that. We need attorneys to help us reach our not only our public but also our regulators, and Brian's been very instrumental in that as well. So I appreciate all your efforts, all of you, and I appreciate the time to talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Very nice. And thank you for so clearly presenting our stance on the issue. Okay, so let's do some questions. There's a few in the chat, and please feel free to add more. Starting with Adie from the beginning. I know, Adie, you responded to this somewhat, but in the chat, and it's a kind of detailed or technical question from Dr. Hom. But I thought you might want to share it with the group in case somebody wasn't following the chat.
Yeah, so this particular this particular publication and that particular figure that I showed for that particular cannabinoid happened to use these two different acids and solvents, which were not the methylated version that the participant was asking about. However, one of the ones that the authors of this particular paper did use was a toluene-based solvent, and that stuff's nasty. So it kind of like the particulars again about which acids and solvents are used to derive which products. You know, they're kind of all interchangeable and they all have their own degrees of toxicity. And then there was a question about, you know, differentiating the isomers of all of these cannabinoids. So it's basically their three-dimensional shape, sort of if they're left-handed or right-handed for the non-chemists. Some of those isomers do have very similar or identical properties in terms of the pharmacology, how they bind to the receptors, the kinds of effects that they produce at those receptors, but some of them don't. And so this is why we need a thorough characterization. If these things are going to be released into the wild, it would be really helpful to know, like, you know, what they do at a cellular level. I hope that there's somebody out there who has, you know, written some grants to just go through and serially establish what is the pharmacology of all these things. There are plenty of labs out there that could be, you know, well poised to do that. But it sure would be nice to have a high throughput system where we just have each of these cannabinoids and we can just see what they do in petri dishes, see what they do in cells, and see what they do in mice. And that would give us like a really nice starting place to infer the degree of similarity, at least between this particular one and delta-9 THC, because we really do know a lot about delta-9. We've been studying it for a very long time. So if we could at least start from a baseline of how similar or dissimilar is it, that would be super helpful.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you along these lines, is there any reason at this point to think that any of these compounds are more toxic than delta-9? I mean, we had K2 and spice, and supposedly those synthetic cannabinoids were, but I know that was really hyped up. So, yeah, and any thoughts on this?
Yeah, we absolutely do have evidence for that. So, for example, THCP has been shown to be 20-fold more potent at the CB1 receptor than delta-9. That means you need 20-fold less to elicit the same effects. So if we're talking about a delta-9 gummy already has, you know, 10 milligrams, and a THCP gummy might have 100 in an entire package, that could most certainly put someone in the emergency department. And similarly with like the acetate esters, you know, those things do indeed, when they are heated, they break apart. They're no longer cannabinoids. And that's exactly what we saw with the spice K2 and, you know, Fubinaca compounds. That when you look at them at room temperature, they're a cannabinoid. And as soon as you heat them up, they break apart into all these other toxins. And for sure, we know that these, you know, acetate esters, they break apart upon heating into toxic ketene gas. You know, again, the question is like, how much of that gas, you know, actually do you need to be exposed to in order to get some kind of negative effects? That's still, you know, an open question, best investigated in animals, in my opinion. But yeah, so we do have enough of a smoking gun to know that we need to be exceptionally careful with all these, because there's not really any way to predict, just looking at the chemical structure, what it's going to do. You know, we can have some kind of educated guess that it is somewhat like delta-9, but that's as far as we can go.
Wow.
Can I just add from a regulatory perspective that important distinction between the relative potencies of different forms of THC is completely missed by regulators, at least when they're doing legislation. So what'll happen is they'll just say, well, you can only have X, you know, milligrams of THC. Well, if we're talking about THCP, that's dangerous. And so there really has to be we have to somehow get the message across that not all THC is created equal.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think some colleagues and I also, we produced a paper at the end of last year that showed that people were more likely to use Delta 8 if they lived in a state that didn't have legal access to Delta 9 THC, naturally derived Delta 9 THC, aka cannabis. So in states without cannabis laws, people are more likely to use these things. So that tells us, that's probably true for all of these other cannabinoids as well. So, it's those, and I'm highlighting that because it's all of those markets who are the most likely to make these kinds of arbitrary decisions about like, okay, here's where we're going to draw the line in the sand, when that line in the sand is absolutely not based on evidence.
Thank you. The next question, I think is a really important and relevant one that we hear a lot. If I understand it correctly, it's to Matt, but others may have thoughts on this as well. In that states that are banning hemp-derived products, companies that manufacture them, I think they're asking if there are regulations, they may either go out of business or these products may be diverted to licensed dispensaries. But I think the question of what happens to these businesses that are now billion-dollar economies, what happens to them if all of a sudden we do slap down this regulation?
If at the state level, I mean, one thing to understand about the cannabis space is I think it's someone from Silicon Valley came in and decided and sort of whispered in its ear, move fast and break things. Meaning a lot of time, like that's kind of what I was hinting at, which is I have no idea if what's going on is illegal, but I think that we've kind of discovered the ultimate loophole, which is if everyone's doing it, then there's enforcement resources are limited. So that's a kind of a long-winded way of saying who knows. I mean, even what's going on now today could be illegal, but because everyone is doing it, it just makes it impossible to, like, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, I think, is a particular example of, I would say most hemp cannabinoid companies probably could get an FDCA notice in the mail for violating some provision of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but the FDA only has a certain number of resources, and there are so many companies and so on and so forth. So really, it kind of depends on, like, the answer to this question is just like, we don't have enough facts. I mean, it kind of depends on whether a state, like if we're talking at the state level, whether a state has the wherewithal to actually go around and enforce. The bigger the company, the easier it is to enforce, ironically. So the more prominent a hemp cannabinoid company is, the easier it is to enforce against that company. If you're looking from the company standpoint, that could be a problem. If you're looking as a consumer or from the market standpoint, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. Like I'm sure there's going to be ways to get these products into the market. I'm here in Texas, and you have no trouble getting those products. In fact, that's kind of encouraged. So it really kind of depends on a lot of things. I don't know how to answer that question, but suffice to say, some regulation, banning it without any like law enforcement, actual enforcement behind it might not actually do anything based on what I've seen.
If I could, I'll offer a slightly different perspective, and that's just I'll do a doom and gloom prediction that the health and safety issues associated with these products will ultimately be their undoing. I think the problem that we have, especially when we're outside of regulatory systems, is they're always judged by our worst offenders. And I don't see any moral barometer guiding how these products are entering into the market. And there are definitely good actors. And my answer to this question is, if the state says no, then go to another state. You've got a lot of states out there that are doing a wide range of models, and you can find a home if this is your mission. But I think sort of this is going to be my perspective on behalf of licensees, saying, I don't like that system. It's too hard for me to participate in, so I'm just going to blow it off and hope not to get in trouble. That's not good policy. And I think that you put enough kids in the ER and people are not going to be tolerant of this for very long. This is not too big to fail, and neither is marijuana legalization, by the way, either. And so I think we just need to make sure that what we're doing is in the best interest of the consumer, and as best we can be guardians of that. I think that's where we have to be.
Thanks. It's been fascinating to watch. I was in Texas, somebody mentioned last week, at the Texas Cannabis Policy Conference, and I've been hearing that, you know, that with all this money coming in for the hemp-derived cannabinoids, that I assume that it's going to the legislatures by lobbyists, and of course, they're now reluctant to pull back and regulate it, given that there's so much in the economy, some's coming their way. And then I found out that some Texas legislatures are actually invested in the business themselves. So, you know, Tanya was addressing that conflict of interest, but when the legislators are invested in this very dangerous situation, it's super concerning. Let me go to the next question from Melissa. And it's to Matt, but I think I'd like to hear from Tanya and Chris as well. How may one consider entering cannabis policy, and in this case, let's talk about minor cannabinoid policy, to assist in advancing legislation towards more research and access for business and patients? So how do we do something about this from an advocate's position?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pass the buck largely to the other speakers because I work kind of on the court side of thing, and I think that when you talk about, you know, what makes legislators tick, it's kind of it's your guess as well as mine. So I'm going to pass the buck to other folks who probably have a lot more experience with that.
Well, I would say that, you know, we should be regulating cannabis in general, cannabinoids in general, so that and the legal, we should be reinvesting some of that money into testing, product safety, research, and you know, I think that's I'm not sure if I understand the question, how we want consider entering cannabis policy, or
Well, I think it's asking, and I hope it's asking, you know, we're an advocacy group, and we want to involve people in getting involved in advocacy.
Yeah, well, I think doing education is the first thing. I don't know that consumers know that there's a risk, and there are alternatives to these minor cannabinoids with actual cannabinoids that are not so minor, that we know a lot about. That we know a lot about CBD, we know a lot about THC, and some of the other non-synthetic minor cannabinoids. We are actually very well versed, and we know how humans and animals react to those products like CBG, CBN, and I think that education is our best advocate, and then we have to educate our legislators as well, to let them know that just because it's hemp derived does not make it safer. If anything, perhaps it's less safe, and the lack of regulation is part of the problem. So yeah, I think education on both ends is the key to safety in the future.
Chris?
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead, Adie.
Well, I was just going to say, like, upstream of education, we have to know what to tell them, right? So that requires a fundamental, you know, understanding of pharmacology and toxicology, and you know, I guess sort of like dovetailed into this question is this, like, how do we actually get that research done? You know, the vast majority of, you know, preclinical pharmacology research in this country comes from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And so it would be really nice if NIDA would prioritize the study of, synthetic cannabinoids, or, hemp-derived cannabinoids and parent cannabinoids, so that we could have some kind of education to distill. I think that, Tanya, you've hit on something really important, which is that all of the wrong people are missing critical information. Policymakers drawing arbitrary lines in the sand has gotten us in trouble time and time again. And then we end up with all of these regulations with unintended consequences that we're trying to have to create new regulations to fix those arbitrary decisions that were uninformed by evidence. And so I think that you're absolutely right. It would be wonderful to have, continuing education for policymakers. That would be a really big deal.
And for doctors.
Definitely.
All right, I'm going to make a pitch, and that is there are a lot of big organizations in DC that care a lot about the fallout related to this issue. And I'm talking about confectioners, I'm talking about folks in the alcohol industry. I'm talking about people that care about drunk driving. There are a lot of folks that are interested. And this is a strange bedfellows moment. And I think this organization is in a good position to try to pull these groups together, because look, you might be surprised, but they don't always want to talk to the marijuana guys. And that puts you in a good position, because you're not that, and you can come at this from a different perspective. What people need in this situation is clarity and leadership, and you're in a position to do that. The things that were just discussed on this call are the pieces that all need to kind of get brought together. But what I would challenge you to do is say, when you say we need to do research, what do you aim to do? And what needs to happen in order for that to be the goal? And now you have the structure of a bill, right? And clarity and leadership, and take that role and say, this is what we need to have. If Dr. Rae, I loved your idea of let's go unpack what these cannabinoids are, because you know what? If you guys don't do it, it's going to be privately owned by corporations that get there first. And maybe that's the way it's just going to go, but maybe there are other ways that it could go as well. So, now the complexity of this issue, but who better to try to find a course that can help, science enter into the conversation in ways it hasn't yet.
And speaking as president of an advocacy group, I would say the best way to advocate is to get involved with groups that are like-minded with you. Melissa had commented that she earned her MPH recently and wants to work in legislation policy. I connected with a MPH student who was actually last semester an intern in the Colorado State Legislature. Connected on LinkedIn. He joined up with us, and he's doing some excellent work with us. And so he's getting involved and not only learning more about legislative policy, but truly helping out. And that's how, Tanya and I are just docs. And I wasn't involved in policy much, but this is something I felt passionate about, public policy and regulating drugs rather than putting people in jail. And I actually kind of found out about the minor cannabinoids on the side and realized, wait, I want to legalize them. I don't want the Wild West out there. So got D4DPR involved in writing up a policy about it and getting word around and doing things like the webinar. So that's what we do. And everybody on this call is interested in the advocacy in some way, and certainly the speakers are as well.
Absolutely. I actually found out about THCO when I was advocating. I was at a meeting and I had never heard of it before until I saw it, and I was like, what is this? And what does it do? And, questions flying. And the guy next to me bought some and he's like, what do you think of this, doc? And I was like, I have no idea, but I would advise you not to try it until we know more. True story.
Okay, any final, we're almost out of time. Any final words from anybody? Okay, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate everyone who came on and stuck with us through the hour and a half. And please let us know what you think. And certainly we welcome you if you're not already a member of D4DPR. We welcome you. All right, take care.